In 1986, the largest merger in the history of the computer industry quietly erased one of America's most consequential corporate names. $4.8 billion, one handshake, and a century of innovation gone. Walk through the old Burroughs headquarters on East McNichols Road in Detroit today, and the building tells you almost nothing. It has been renamed, repurposed. The sign above the door no longer carries the name of the man who changed how the world counted its money. What once served as the nerve center of a computing empire that stretched across 100 countries and employed 65,000 people has become something else entirely. A reminder not of triumph, but of the slow, grinding machinery of obsolescence. At its peak, Burroughs was not simply a company. It was a civilization of commerce. Its machines processed the checks of 14,000 American banks. Its computers processed the very first message ever transmitted through the global banking network, SWIFT. Its engineers built the bombsight that guided the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Its architects of code designed operating systems that were a full decade ahead of their time. Systems that experts today still cite as some of the most elegant ever conceived. Then something went wrong. Slowly, irrevocably. The kind of wrong that never announces itself loudly but compounds in silence across years of missed opportunity, stubborn pride, and a marketplace that stopped caring. By the mid-1980s, Burroughs was desperate, swallowed by debt, outrun by IBM, hemorrhaging talent. And the merger it celebrated as salvation turned out to be, for many who lived through it, something closer to a burial. So how does a company that invented the first practical adding machine, pioneered the world's first virtual memory operating system, and wired the global banking infrastructure disappear from the public consciousness entirely? The story of the Burroughs Corporation is the story of American industrial genius, of visionary engineering built on the bones of a dying man's dream, and of how even the most brilliant machines become relics when the world decides to move on. Welcome inside the Burroughs factory, where a century of invention met its silence. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. This is one of the most fascinating and overlooked stories in American industrial history, and we're just getting started. 1884, St. Louis, Missouri. The air inside Joseph Boyer's machine shop on Dixon Street was thick with metal shavings and oil smoke, the kind of place where ideas were beaten into existence with iron and patience. Working somewhere inside that shop, hunched over a workbench with hands that should have belonged to a clockmaker, was a 29-year-old man named William Seward Burroughs. He was sick. He had been sick for years. Born in Auburn, New York on January 28, 1855, Burroughs had spent his young adulthood fighting a respiratory illness that doctors never quite named and never quite cured. A physician had sent him south and west to the warmer air of Missouri, hoping the climate might extend his life. It gave him something else instead. It gave him the machine shop. It gave him time, and it gave him an obsession. Burroughs had worked as a bank clerk at the Cayuga County National Bank in Auburn before moving to St. Louis, and the experience had left him with a precise understanding of human misery. Specifically, the misery of sitting at a wooden desk adding columns of numbers by hand for 8 hours a day. Arithmetic was the backbone of the entire commercial world, and it was done almost entirely in the minds and fingers of exhausted clerks who made errors that cost banks and businesses untold fortunes. Burroughs was convinced he could build a machine to solve it. He had a $700 investment from a businessman named Thomas Metcalf. He had the use of Boyer's shop, and he had a design that lived, for the moment, entirely in his imagination. The early prototypes were disasters. Walk up to one of the first models, pull the handle, and it might give you an answer that bore no relation to reality. Different operators pulled the handle with different force. Different force meant different speed. Different speed meant different answers. The machine was unreliable in a way that made bankers furious and Burroughs frantic. Then, in a few intense days of problem solving, he invented a device called the dashpot, a small mechanical governor, essentially a cylinder that absorbed the variance in pulling force and regulated the handle's motion so the mechanism moved at a consistent, correct speed regardless of the user's hand. A single elegant mechanism, a single solution. In 1888, the patent was granted. The American Arithmometer Company was formally established with Metcalf and two other St. Louis businessmen, R.M. Scruggs and William R. Pye. By 1890, the machine was in the hands of bankers. By 1895, sales had reached 284 units per year. William Seward Burroughs would not live to see what came next. 1900, St. Louis, Missouri. The sales ledger for the American Arithmometer Company read 972 units sold that year, a figure that seemed small until you considered that just 13 years earlier, the company had sold 50. At the Paris Exposition of 1900, the Burroughs machine won the gold medal for mechanical ingenuity. The world was beginning to notice, but the man who built it was already 2 years dead. William Seward Burroughs had died on September 14, 1898, in Citronelle, Alabama, the same warm climate that had bought him years he should not have had. He was 43. He died before the money came, before the empire, before his name became a household word in every bank in America. Under the steady leadership of Joseph Boyer, who became president in 1902, the company did not grieve. It expanded. And by 1904, St. Louis was simply too small. The entire company moved to Detroit, Michigan, all of its employees loaded onto a single chartered train called the Cloverleaf Express, carrying the weight of a corporate future with them north and east through the American heartland. In Detroit, they built a 70,000-square-foot factory. The following year, 1905, the company was renamed the Burroughs Adding Machine Company, a gesture of belated honor to the man who had made all of it possible. Growth under Boyer was extraordinary. By 1905, total annual sales had climbed to 7,804 machines. Employment reached 1,200 workers in that same year. The product line expanded rapidly. The Class II duplex model for dual totals, the Class VI for bookkeeping, the Pike machines acquired around 1910, which allowed operators to see the printing tape as they worked, which earned the nickname the Visible. Each new model solved a new problem. Each problem solved opened a new market. By 1920, 800,000 Burroughs machines had been sold worldwide. Employment in Detroit alone had reached 12,000 workers. The company listed its stock on the New York Stock Exchange. It established major operations in Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico. A manufacturing plant opened in Nottingham, England in 1898 had become the beachhead for European expansion that eventually stretched to 60 countries. The factory in Detroit was no longer just a factory. It was the beating heart of global commerce. And Burroughs was, without question, the largest adding machine company in the world. But even as the machines rolled off the line by the hundreds of thousands, something was already stirring that would eventually shake everything. 1942, Detroit, Michigan. The assembly lines that had for decades produced the clicking, printing precision of the Burroughs adding machine went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with commerce. In 1942, as American industry pivoted to the demands of total war, Burroughs Corporation was ordered to halt civilian machine production entirely. No more calculators, no more ledger machines, no more bookkeeping systems for the banks that had built the company's fortune across half a century. Instead, the Norden bombsight. It was one of the most classified pieces of military equipment in the American arsenal, a gyroscopic electromechanical targeting device that allowed bomber crews to calculate the precise moment of release for their payloads from altitudes that would otherwise have made accurate bombing impossible. Burroughs began producing the Norden bombsight in 1942 and continued through the duration of American involvement in the conflict. The complexity of the device was staggering. More than 2,000 precision components, tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, mechanisms that had to function perfectly at temperatures that froze metal and at altitudes where human judgment failed. In 1944, the United States Army and Navy jointly awarded Burroughs the Army-Navy E-Pennant for excellence in wartime manufacturing. It was the highest civilian production honor the military could bestow. Then came August 1945. The Enola Gay lifted off from Tinian Island in the Pacific, carrying a bomb called Little Boy. The bomb site guiding the drop was a Burroughs-built Norden, Hiroshima. The war changed Burroughs in ways that went far beyond the production line. The military contracts had forced the company's engineers into territory they had never explored. Precision electronics, complex analog computing, the marriage of mathematics and mechanism at scales previously unimaginable. When the guns went quiet in 1945 and civilian production resumed, 46 new models introduced in a single year, the engineers who returned from wartime contracts brought something new back with them: an appetite, a technical fluency, an understanding that the adding machine, for all its elegant precision, was only the beginning. By 1948, Burroughs' revenues had crossed $100 million. Its bookkeeping machines were operating in 14,000 American banks. The slogan they adopted told the story of their ambition in 4 words: wherever there's business, there's Burroughs. They were right, but only for a little while longer. The world was preparing to make the adding machine obsolete, and the men behind that transformation were not in Detroit. 1953, Detroit, Michigan. The Burroughs Adding Machine Company died, officially, quietly, on the morning its board voted to change the corporate name. No obituary was written for it. No ceremony was held. The sign on the Detroit headquarters simply became something new: the Burroughs Corporation. A name that said, plainly and without sentiment, that the age of the adding machine was over, and whatever came next would have to be something larger. The pivot had been building for years. The war had shown Burroughs what machines could become when ambition exceeded arithmetic. The emerging field of digital computing, still raw, expensive, and largely confined to universities and government laboratories, was increasingly visible on the horizon. IBM was already there, already moving, and Burroughs understood that to remain irrelevant was to begin dying. In the same year as the name change, Burroughs delivered UDEC, the Unitized Digital Electronic Computer, to the Wayne State University Computation Lab in Detroit. UDEC weighed several tons. It contained 10 miles of wire and cable. It used 3,000 vacuum tubes and 7,000 transistors. It was not beautiful, but it worked. And it was a proof of concept. Burroughs could build computers. Then came the acquisition that changed everything. In June of 1956, Burroughs purchased the Electrodata Corporation of Pasadena, California, a spin-off from the Consolidated Engineering Corporation with deep ties to the California Institute of Technology. Electrodata had already produced the Datatron 205 and was midway through the Datatron 220. With that acquisition, Burroughs did not merely buy a product line. It bought a population of engineers who thought about computing differently than anyone in Detroit. It also introduced the E101, a desk-sized electronic digital computer priced at $30,000, which included a magnetic drum memory and could execute scientific and business calculations that would have required rooms full of clerks just a decade before. The banking sector, which had sustained Burroughs through the adding machine era, became the foundation of the computing era as well. Working with the Federal Reserve Bank through the late 1950s, Burroughs helped develop magnetic ink character recognition, MICR, the technology that enabled the automated reading and sorting of bank checks. It was a solution so effective that it was immediately adopted as the industry standard. The company that once counted money was now teaching machines to read it. If you're finding this story fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us continue bringing you these deep dives into history. There is so much more of this story still to tell, and the most extraordinary part is still ahead. 1961, Detroit, Michigan. In the computing world of the early 1960s, the dominant logic was assembly language, instructions written in a code barely one step above raw machine commands, requiring programmers to think not in human terms, but in the terms of the machine itself. IBM's machines spoke this language. Nearly all mainframes did. It was slow, painful work, and the gap between what a programmer imagined and what a machine could produce was vast. Then came the B5000. Announced in February of 1961 and built by a team under the direction of engineer Robert Barton, the B5000 was unlike anything that had come before it. Its architecture was founded on a radical philosophy that Burroughs called language-directed design. Rather than forcing programmers to speak the language of the machine was built to understand the language of programmers. Specifically, Algol 60 and Cobol 61, among the most sophisticated high-level programming languages in existence at the time. The machine used a 48-bit word length. Its memory system implemented something called virtual memory, the ability to run programs larger than the physical memory installed in the machine by managing what was actually loaded at any given moment. This was not a trick borrowed from competitors. This was pioneered by Burroughs, years before IBM would implement anything comparable. The B5000 also ran the world's first operating system written entirely in a high-level language, the Master Control Program, or MCP, written in ESPAL, a variant of ALGOL, almost a decade before the Unix operating system appeared. John Massey, a computing scientist of great distinction, would later describe the B5000 architecture as one of the systems he admired most in the history of computing. In 1982, 20 years after the machine's introduction, computer scientist Alistair Mayer published a paper whose title told the entire story. The architecture of the Burroughs B5000, 20 years later and still ahead of the times. The machine was not merely a product, it was a vision, a philosophy of computing rendered in metal and code. But here's the thing about being ahead of your time. Customers in 1961 did not necessarily want to be ahead of their time. They wanted to run their payroll. They wanted something their existing programmers could learn. They wanted what IBM was already selling, familiar, serviceable, and backed by a sales force that could service equipment in any city in America. The B5000 was brilliant. IBM was ubiquitous. 1974, Brussels, Belgium. A consortium of 239 banks from 15 countries was trying to solve a problem that had existed as long as international banking itself: how to transmit financial messages between institutions in different nations quickly, securely, and without ambiguity. Telex cables were slow, manual transmission was error-prone. The cost of mistakes in international finance was measured not in dollars but in crises. After an exhaustive global selection process conducted by the newly organized Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, SWIFT, Burroughs Corporation of Detroit was chosen to supply the computer equipment and build the backbone switching system for what would become the central nervous system of global banking. It was a staggering vote of confidence. SWIFT, when it sent its first live message in 1977, was entrusting the movement of hundreds of billions of dollars daily to Burroughs-built infrastructure. Every major bank on Earth would eventually pass its international transactions through this system. It was the invisible foundation of modern financial civilization, and it ran on Burroughs machines. This was not a coincidence. It was the culmination of 20 years of deliberate positioning. In the 1950s, Burroughs had worked with the Federal Reserve Bank on the Micker check processing system, entrenching itself in the daily operations of American banking. Its medium systems computers, the B2700 and B3700 series, were processing 65,000 checks per hour for regional Federal Reserve banks by the mid-1970s. A Burroughs B4700 in Cincinnati could sort and read 90 checks per second. The large systems, the B6500 and B6700 series mainframes, had penetrated nearly every major financial institution in the world. These machines had inherited the B5000's revolutionary architecture, its virtual memory, its multi-processor capabilities, its stack-based execution that made high-level code run with startling efficiency. By 1977, the year SWIFT went live, Burroughs' revenues had crossed $2 billion. The company operated in 100 countries. It employed tens of thousands of engineers, salespeople, and technicians. Its logo, the bold Burroughs B, appeared on machines in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, in the largest commercial banks of Europe, in governments, hospitals, insurance companies, and airlines across 6 continents. For one brief, shining moment in the late 1970s, Burroughs looked exactly like what it believed itself to be: indispensable. The storm was already forming. 1964, Armonk, New York. On April 7, 1964, International Business Machines Corporation introduced the System/360, a family of compatible mainframe computers spanning a range of performance levels, all running the same software, all supported by the same vast IBM service infrastructure. It was perhaps the most consequential product launch in the history of the computer industry, and it changed the competitive mathematics of the mainframe market overnight. The problem for Burroughs was not technical, it was structural. IBM had built something that transcended any individual machine, an ecosystem. Buy a System/360 and you had access to thousands of trained programmers, an ocean of third-party software, a global service network that could put a field engineer at your door within hours. Upgrade to a larger model and your existing software ran unchanged. The machine grew with your business. It spoke a language that your entire staff already knew. Burroughs had brilliant machines. The B5000 architecture was legitimately more advanced than anything IBM had produced. Computer scientists knew this. What the corporate buyers of the 1960s and 70s knew was something different. IBM showed up. IBM had financing options. IBM had relationships. And when something broke at 2 in the morning, IBM fixed it. The industry analysts of the era codified this reality with a casual brutality. IBM was the giant, and the rest of the computing world, Honeywell, NCR Corporation, Control Data, General Electric, Digital Equipment, RCA, Sperry Rand, and Burroughs, were collectively known as IBM and the Seven Dwarfs. Burroughs was never the biggest dwarf, but it was the most technically distinguished. By 1972, General Electric and RCA had already conceded defeat and exited the mainframe business entirely. The remaining 5 competitors behind IBM, Burroughs, Univac, NCR, Control Data, and Honeywell, formed an acronym the industry called the Bunch. It was not a flattering nickname. It implied a huddle of the less powerful, circling each other in a market dominated by a company 20 times their size. The CEO who understood this most clearly was W. Michael Blumenthal, who took the helm of Burroughs in 1980. A former U.S. Treasury Secretary under President Jimmy Carter, Blumenthal was a strategist before he was an engineer. He looked at the competitive landscape and reached a conclusion that was simple, controversial, and ultimately catastrophic. Burroughs could not fight IBM alone. 1981. Multiple cities. The recession of the early 1980s hit the computing industry without mercy. Corporate budgets contracted. Capital expenditures on mainframe equipment, always one of the first things cut when revenues fell, dried up across industries that had represented Burroughs' most reliable customers. Simultaneously, something new and deeply threatening was rising from the consumer electronics world: the mini-computer, then the microcomputer. Then, in August of 1981, IBM itself introduced the IBM Personal Computer, a machine small enough to sit on a desk, cheap enough to fit inside a departmental budget, and capable enough to handle tasks that had previously required a dedicated mainframe terminal and a specialized operator. The mainframe market, the only market Burroughs had ever truly mastered, was being cut at its knees. Burroughs tried to respond. In 1982, the company introduced its own personal computer line, the B20 and B25 models, powered by Intel 8086 and 8088 processors and running an operating system called BTOS, licensed from a California company named Convergent Technologies. These machines could share a hard disk across a local network, an early and genuinely useful capability, and were eventually manufactured in Kunming, China under a bilateral agreement. But they were late. The personal computer market was already being defined by IBM-compatible machines, and a proprietary system from a mainframe company carried little appeal for a market that was rapidly standardizing around open architecture. At the same time, the economic pressure was forcing hard choices in the factories. In 1981 alone, Burroughs implemented widespread layoffs, reducing its workforce by hundreds at multiple facilities. The Goleta, California facility was closed that year. The Yaphank plant on Long Island followed in 1982. The company that had once employed tens of thousands of people in a single Detroit complex was contracting, not collapsing. Not yet. The banking relationships were still strong. The SWIFT contract was still live. The large systems continued selling. But the momentum had shifted in ways that the company's leadership was not fully willing to acknowledge. CEO Ray McDonald, who had guided Burroughs through the expansion of the 1960s and 70s before handing the reins to Blumenthal, had built the company's identity around institutional banking. That identity was now a vulnerability. The world Burroughs had been built to serve was changing. 1985, Detroit, Michigan. The centennial celebration at Burroughs Corporation was, by any outward measure, a triumph. 100 years. Operations spanning 100 countries. Annual revenues of $5 billion. A workforce of 65,000 people deployed across the globe. A new corporate identity program was unveiled. Advertisements celebrated a century of innovation that had, in truth, been extraordinary. From the adding machine in a St. Louis machine shop to the backbone of the global banking network, from the Norden bombsight to the most architecturally sophisticated mainframe computers ever built. The numbers looked impressive, the narrative was compelling, and underneath it all, the reality was quietly terrifying. By 1985, Burroughs had been running on borrowed confidence for years. The personal computer revolution was not slowing down. IBM's dominance in the mainframe market remained absolute. Burroughs was still, as it always had been, a distant second. The bunch competitors were themselves shrinking, consolidating, surrendering market share. The broader trend was unmistakable. The era of proprietary mainframe computing was approaching its twilight. W. Michael Blumenthal had reached a conclusion he could no longer defer. Two smaller computing companies could not separately fight IBM. But what if they stopped being two companies? Burroughs had been watching Sperry Corporation, the maker of UNIVAC computers, itself a storied and technically capable firm, for some time. In 1985, Burroughs launched a takeover bid of $65 per share, a total value of approximately $3.7 billion. Sperry's board refused. Sperry's executives argued for independence and sought alternative buyers. There were none. With Blumenthal's determination, Burroughs came back in May of 1986 with an improved offer of $70 per share, initiating a 4-week corporate battle. Sperry erected defenses. It launched an $80 per share stock buyback offer. It searched desperately for a white knight. The search produced nothing. Sperry eventually agreed to a deal at $76.50 per share, a total acquisition price of $4.8 billion. At that afternoon announcement on May 29, 1986, in the opulent surroundings of the St. Regis Hotel in Manhattan, W. Michael Blumenthal and Sperry CEO Gerald Probst shook hands before the cameras. Everyone in that room believed they were watching the creation of an IBM rival. What they were actually witnessing was the beginning of the end. We're halfway through this incredible story. If you're enjoying it, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support means everything and helps us keep producing these deep dives into American industrial history. What happens next to this company is something most people have never heard. September 1986, Bluebell, Pennsylvania. The paperwork was signed. The deal was done. In September of 1986, Burroughs Corporation and Sperry Corporation formally ceased to exist as independent entities. In their place stood Unisys Corporation, a name chosen from over 31,000 suggestions submitted by employees, its syllables drawn from the words United, Information, and Systems. The combined company immediately became the second largest computer company in the world, with revenues of $10.5 billion. The headlines were celebratory. The analysts were cautiously optimistic. Inside both companies, the mood was something closer to dread. The fundamental problem had been obvious before the deal closed and was ignored anyway. Burroughs and Sperry ran entirely different computer architectures. Their machines did not speak the same language. Their software ecosystems were incompatible. Their engineering cultures had developed separately over decades and held each other in the barely concealed contempt of proud rivals. To merge them was not to create a unified company. It was to create two separate companies sharing the same letterhead and the same crushing debt load. The debt was the most immediate catastrophe. Burroughs had paid $4.8 billion for Sperry, in cash and securities. That money had to come from somewhere. It came in the form of debt that sat on Unisys like a stone. The company had borrowed heavily to finance the most expensive merger in the history of the computer industry, at precisely the moment when the computer industry was convulsing through its most disruptive structural shift. Within 2 years of the merger, the Unisys workforce was reduced by 20%. 24,000 of the 121,000 combined positions were eliminated. Unwanted business units were sold off. In early November of 1986, Burroughs agreed to sell part of its Memorex disk drive division for $550 million. Sperry's aerospace and marine division was sold to Honeywell in December of 1986. One investment banker who worked on the Sperry side of the transaction later described the merger with a precision that the boardroom presentations had lacked. "We used to kid each other that it was like strapping two one-legged men together and trying to get them to walk. They just created a bigger problem." The name Burroughs was gone from the industry, forever. 1989, Bluebell, Pennsylvania. Unisys posted a net loss of $639 million. The year after that, in 1990, the losses continued. $436 million. Then came 1991, and the recession that hammered the global economy hit Unisys with particular ferocity, sending the company's annual loss to $1.39 billion. The stock, which had traded near $50 per share in 1987, collapsed to a low of $1.75 during 1990. Bankruptcy loomed. The structural reasons were not complicated. Unisys was simultaneously maintaining two separate computer architectures, the Burroughs A-series systems and the Sperry UNIVAC 1100 line, because abandoning either would mean losing the customers who depended on it. But running two separate research and development operations, two separate marketing divisions, two separate service networks for two incompatible product lines, while servicing the massive debt from the original acquisition, while the overall market for proprietary mainframes was being systematically dismantled by the rise of open architecture server computing, was financially impossible. By 1996, 10 years after the merger, what had once been a global workforce of 124,000 people had been reduced to 37,400 employees. The Detroit headquarters, the building that had been rebuilt in 1966 to serve as Burroughs' global command center, constructed on the footprint of the five-floor addition begun in 1918, was sold. It was eventually acquired by Henry Ford Health and renamed One Ford Place. The Burroughs name on the facade was replaced. Another piece of the history was quietly erased. Unisys did survive. A severe restructuring led by CEO James Unruh in the early 1990s, involving mass layoffs, asset sales, and a dramatic narrowing of strategic focus, pulled the company back from the edge of bankruptcy by 1992. But survival is not the same as vitality. The grand ambition of creating an IBM rival, the vision that had driven Blumenthal to spend $4.8 billion and consume the legacy of both Burroughs and Sperry, never materialized. The old Burroughs engineers who had stayed through the merger watched the A-series line, the direct descendants of the B5000's revolutionary architecture, shrink to a niche product serving legacy banking customers. A century of innovation reduced to a maintenance contract. 1982. Detroit, Michigan, a research laboratory. Before the merger consumed everything, before the collapse and the restructuring and the name change on the building, Burroughs engineers were still producing work that deserved to outlast all of it. In 1982, the company had published the paper that would define its legacy in the academy, even as it faltered in the market. Alistair Mayer's analysis of the B5000 architecture, published in the ACM SIGARCH Computer Architecture News, laid out with unsettling clarity just how far ahead of its era the 1961 machine had been. Virtual memory, stack-based execution, hardware-enforced data tagging that prevented programs from corrupting each other's memory, a security feature that computing would not widely implement elsewhere for decades. An operating system written in a high-level language before such a thing was even considered thinkable. The Master Control Program, MCP, the operating system that had been written in SBOL, a variant of ALGOL, was itself a monument. It was running on Burroughs machines a full decade before Unix arrived. Its command interface had evolved into a compiled, structured programming language with declarations, statements, and procedures. The system's multiprocessor architecture allowed up to 6 CPUs to share memory symmetrically, a level of parallel computing capability that most of the industry would not reach until the 1990s. The Burroughs B5000's architecture inspired the Hollywood film Tron, whose screenwriters borrowed the name Master Control Program for the film's antagonist, the only instance in computing history where a real operating system's name became a cinematic villain. The company had also built the defense computer D825, described by some scholars as the first true multiprocessor computer ever constructed. It had built the guidance systems for the Army's Pershing missile. It had built systems that helped check the electronics of the Air Force's F-111 Aardvark fighter plane. And yet, none of this was enough. The problem was never the quality of what Burroughs built. The problem was that building brilliantly is not the same as building broadly. Proprietary architecture, no matter how elegant, creates a wall around the customer as much as a fortress for the company. Every customer who locked themselves into the Burroughs ecosystem found that wall useful until they didn't, and then they found it a cage. IBM had built the same walls, but IBM's walls enclosed a continent. Burroughs' walls enclosed a neighborhood. 1986, New York City, the St. Regis Hotel. Two men shook hands, a name vanished, but not every thread was cut. The Burroughs A-series mainframes, the direct architectural descendants of the B5000, running the MCP operating system, still serving the banking and government clients who had built their operations on Burroughs infrastructure, continued inside Unisys under the ClearPath brand. Some of those clients were still running versions of software written in the 1970s. The architecture was simply too stable, too reliable, too embedded in critical financial infrastructure to be discarded. By the early 2000s, the Unisys ClearPath MCP line, the living continuation of what Robert Barton and his team had conceived in 1961, was still being actively developed, still selling to a loyal base of institutions for whom the phrase critical infrastructure was not a metaphor. Even today, the philosophical DNA of the B5000 runs in servers around the world. Then there is the name itself. In 2010, Unisys sold its payment systems division to Marlin Equity Partners, a California-based private investment firm. That division, specializing in check processing equipment, the direct descendant of Burroughs' decades-long relationship with American banking, was incorporated as Burroughs Payment Systems Incorporated, headquartered in Plymouth, Michigan. In 2012, it simplified to Burroughs Incorporated. The name Burroughs exists again, quietly, in the payment technology industry. Not as a computing giant, not as the company that built the machine that changed the way the world counted, but as a mid-sized technology firm processing payments in a world that has largely forgotten who invented the infrastructure it runs on. And then there is the shadow of the man himself. William Seward Burroughs, the bank clerk from Auburn, New York, who died at 43 before seeing a dollar of what he built, left something that outlasted every machine he ever designed. His grandson, also named William Seward Burroughs, grew up in the long cultural shadow of the adding machine fortune and became one of the most radical literary figures of the 20th century. The author of Naked Lunch, a founding voice of the Beat generation, a man who made his name by breaking every rule of language in roughly the same spirit that his grandfather had broken every rule about arithmetic. Two men, one name. Both believed that the world's inherited systems of counting, of writing, of thinking were insufficient, and both spent their lives building something to replace them. What separated them from the companies and institutions around them was precisely that: the willingness to believe the world could be done differently. Walk past the corner of East McNichols Road and John R. Street in Detroit today, and the old Burroughs World headquarters stands in the long Michigan light, its architecture still imposing, its history now belonging to a health system rather than a computing empire. One Ford Place. The name on the door tells you nothing about what happened inside for a century. But if you look closely enough, the story is still there. In the pattern of the banking software that processes your check, in the architecture that the computing historians keep returning to decade after decade, unable to shake the feeling that the designers of the B5000 in 1961 knew something that the rest of the industry took 30 years to learn. In the SWIFT network, still running today, still moving trillions of dollars across global institutions daily, still, after all these years, ultimately descended from the system that Burroughs built. What does the story of Burroughs teach? The first lesson is the danger of brilliant insularity. Burroughs built machines that were architecturally ahead of every competitor, but built them in a way that bound customers to Burroughs exclusively. Proprietary excellence is a powerful short-term asset and a slow-motion strategic liability. The companies that survived the computing revolution of the 1980s did not do so by being the most brilliant. They did so by being the most open. Burroughs chose genius over accessibility, and the market, in the end, chose the opposite. The second lesson is the cost of scale anxiety. The merger with Sperry was not irrational. The logic of combining two struggling mainframe companies to challenge IBM was comprehensible in the boardrooms of 1985. But comprehensible is not the same as sound. The merger destroyed both companies' identities, loaded the combined entity with catastrophic debt, and produced something that was neither Burroughs nor Sperry, but a dysfunctional hybrid of both. Desperation in the boardroom produces decisions that look bold in May and catastrophic by December. The third lesson is the deepest, that timing is not negotiable. Burroughs spent most of its computing life being technically correct and commercially insufficient. The B5000 was the right answer, given to a market that was not yet asking the right question. Virtual memory, language-directed design, hardware data protection, All of these would eventually become the foundation of modern computing. But Burroughs was not there to receive the credit. 100 years of operation, from 1886 to 1986. From a $700 investment in a St. Louis machine shop to a $4.8 billion merger in a Manhattan hotel. From 1,200 workers in a Detroit factory to 65,000 employees across 100 countries. From a sick man's obsession with accuracy to an empire whose accuracy nobody could question. The name is quieter now. The building wears a different sign. But somewhere, deep in the infrastructure of global finance, in the silent movement of trillions of dollars across the world's banking networks, the ghost of the Burroughs machine still works. Counting. Always counting.